afternoon, distinguished colleagues and all participants joining us. On behalf of Nissim Oncogenics and our partners at the GMA Central, it is my privilege to welcome you to today's webinar, the third of our series dubbed OncoFront Africa. At Nissim, we believe we stand at a pivotal crossroads for cancer care in Africa. Cancer is often thought of as a distant threat, but it is an urgent reality with incidence and mortality rates rising across our communities. Regardless of this reality, the landscape of clinical trial in oncology on our continent remains nascent. Today, less than 2% of global cancer clinical trials are conducted in Africa, despite population representing nearly 17% of the world. This disparity is not just a statistic, it is a call to action. Clinical trials are the engine of progress in oncology, turning hope into evidence and evidence into life-saving therapies. For Africa, they are not merely a scientific enterprise. They are a matter of equity and justice. Without robust clinical research conducted in African populations, our patients are left behind receiving treatments that may not be tailored to our unique genetic, environmental, and sociocultural context. Today's agenda is designed to spark critical conversations and inspire collective action. We will hear from leading experts on the significance of clinical trials, the vital role of pathology, the necessity of resilient health systems, and the imperative of strong governance and ethical frameworks. What is unique about today is a breakout session that will allow us to delve deeper into these themes and to interact with speakers. The future of oncology in Africa depends on the foundations we lay today. Foundations built on science, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment to our patients. I would like to send an apology on behalf of Professor Ajay, our first speaker, who unfortunately has an urgent last-minute engagement and cannot join us. His session will be delivered later in subsequent webinar series. In his place, co-founder of Nissim Oncogenics, Edwina Ayabila, will cover the theme. With that, it's my honor to invite our host, Dr. Vanessa Atikwe, to begin proceedings. Thank you, and welcome to a conversation that matters.
Thank you so much, Francis. I appreciate, and yes, indeed, this is the third year running, and indeed, I'm thrilled and excited. Good afternoon to each and every one of us. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are dialing or you have dialed in from. I'm Vanessa Atikwe, and I will be your host for this session. I'm extremely thrilled to be doing this again, and we've anticipated this session, and it's going to be engaging, it's going to be educative, it's going to be knowledge-filled, and I'm definitely thrilled to have to be doing this. So would Edwina give a few details or a few comments before we proceed with the speakers, or do we just delve in right away?
So Edwina has asked me to let you know, since she's going to be the first speaker, she would introduce herself when she's speaking. So
Very well.
Yeah.
Very well. Okay. Well, that's fine. That's very good. So basically, this webinar is on foundations of clinical trials in oncology, an African perspective. And the purpose of this webinar is to set the tone for us as researchers, for us as clinicians, for us as well-wishers and policymakers to be able to understand oncology and research in our part of the world. And just as Francis mentioned, to be able to give our patients, our clients, the right medications or the right management based on our factors, as well as our entire makeup. So that is the purpose of this. And definitely it would be a continuity as we understand and learn more about oncology and the research in African environment. So I would go straight to Edwina, who would introduce herself, and then she would start the conversation, and we can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Okay. My name is Edwina Ayaba Yabila, a co-founder of NISIM and a clinical oncologist by profession. I'm going to present on advancing oncology in Africa, the role of the clinical trials, and then global collaboration. I'm just standing in for Prophet J, or trying to stand in the shoes of Prophet J, because we had to excuse him for an emergency. All right. I have no disclosures. I have no disclosures to make, and this is the outline of. So we will all admit that cancer burden is rising rapidly in Africa, with a projectile doubling of cases and deaths by 2040 from GlobalCan and other well-resourced organizations. And the causes for the rising cancer burden is estimated to be population growth, population aging, and we shifting more towards Western lifestyle. Our common cancer incidents usually are the breast cancer, cervical cancer, lung cancer, liver cancer, and prostate cancer. It doesn't mean other cancers are not important, but these are the prevalent ones that we have. Clinical trials have been shown to be crucial for research and as well as improving patients' care. It's been shown to improve patient access to cutting-edge therapies, and it has also been shown to drive critical investment in care infrastructure, as well as increase capacity and capability the facilities in which these clinical trials are carried out. So what that means is that for every nation or for every country that takes clinical trials, particularly in oncology seriously, they tend to have better outcomes because of this infrastructure boost. And research has shown that it causes about 85% boost in infrastructure. Now, Africa only participates in about 2.5% of the worldwide clinical trials that are going on. That is woefully inadequate, considering that we are home to about 50% of the world genetic diversity. Now, this percentage of genetic diversity that we have implies that we are actually very important when it comes to understanding disease biology and then therapeutics. And unfortunately, we are also the ones that are least represented in clinical trials. So this makes conversations like this very important so that we are self-aware and then we try to get more involved in clinical trials. So as I said earlier, we are woefully underrepresented in clinical research, and we only make up about 2.5. And that 2.5 is actually a recent data. As of 2019, we're only making up about 1% of the world data, which is still not something to be proud of. And within the continent, this limited clinical research is still concentrated to some limited areas. You have Egypt and South Africa making up about 2/3 of all the African clinical trials that are going on. Kenya and Algeria also emerging as one of the research centers. And then other African countries are just left with marginal presence in these studies. Clinical trials does have an impact on patient outcome. It allows us to introduce to new treatments. So they have access to innovative treatments or therapy. And this is particularly important for patients who have rare or very complex conditions where standard of treatments may be limited. So the patient benefits if they get access to some of these clinical trials. It also enhances the care we provide for the patients as well, because now we have a higher standard of care when a patient is in a clinical trial. There is frequent monitoring, there is frequent follow-up, and that leads to earlier detection of complications or disease progression. And then the patient gets to have early intervention for some of these complications or progressions that they have. It has also been shown to improve disease outcomes as well. Patients who are typically involved in clinical trials have been shown to have a survival rate of about 10% higher than the average population who are not involved in clinical trials. Again, it also reduces complications because of the rigorous monitoring that is ensured in clinical trials as well. Now, with regards to local validation, it serves as a source of evidence-based medicine for us, because we then get to have what is our own best practice for our patients. Sorry. So with regards to global collaboration, it will help us address a few issues if we are able to take part in clinical trials with other countries or other nations as well, or continents as well. One of the main issues that global collaboration will help us address include addressing the global disparities that we see in oncology. Africa, unfortunately, is burdened with increased incidence and then mortality of cancer-related diseases. We have also limited access to advanced cancer treatments and research opportunity. So what that means is that our patients tend to have poorer outcomes. When we collaborate, what it does is it bridges the gap by providing access, which improves the overall outcome of our patients as well. Now, Africa can also use global collaboration to leverage our resources. We have very unique cancer profiles. Our cancers are a bit different. We have very distinct cancer incidence pattern. So, for instance, when you take breast cancer, globally, it seems to be more of patients who are in their 40s getting to their 50s, thereabouts. But for us, we are seeing very young adults with cancers. We are seeing patients in their 30s, in their 20s, with very high incidence of breast cancer. So we have a very unique disease profile that we could actually harness to our advantage. And then when you come to our settings too, we could also harness our knowledge and then our insights in the local context to collaborate with global researchers to lead to comprehensive and then effective approach to cancer research and treatment overall. And then we could also use these global interactions or global collaboration to build our own local capacity, where we'll build human resource capacity. We'll also build infrastructure as well by establishing and strengthening our labs, our registries. Our registries are usually nothing to write home about because most of us don't really have longitudinal registries. And then we could also establish better clinical trials.
What about the KCCR project?
These researchers that are So how is Africa as a continent initiating some of these research capacities? What are we doing to make things better for us? A few things have been done. We have AOTIC organizing or trying to standardize guidelines for us to help with research practices on the continent, which is something that is available. And if individuals are interested, they could easily get access to. They also provide us some grants so that we can also do some of these researches as well. The African Virtual Platform for Oncology Clinical Trials Registry is a concept that has been proposed, but is yet to be fully established. But if it should go into implementation, it will lead to better collaboration and data sharing among we Africans and then with our international partners as well. We've found out that a few facilities are also trying to move more into some form of precision medicine, like facilities in Kenya, in South Africa, and then in Nigeria. In Ghana, well, you have more of private organizations trying to move towards precision medicine in a way. For instance, we have NISIM, which is a local startup that is trying to reach international level. We have Pathologists Without Borders offering very good research capacities to clinicians who are interested in it, and then they can collaborate with them to do some of these works as well. And then we also have Yamachi and then Revna. So these are all things that locally we are all trying to do to help improve the research capacity of the continent.
You're watching some
of the challenges we face as a continent is multiple. We have systemic barriers, we have infrastructure limitations as well, and then we have our own patient level obstacles as well. With regards to the systemic barriers, we have issues with funding, which is non-existent in most facilities or most organizations in the country. So we need to rely on foreign grants for some of these things, which becomes a bit difficult for us. Again, when it comes to regulations, we have difficulty, or we struggle to meet international good clinical practice standards. So this affects our integrity and the validity of our research findings as well. And then again, when you want ethical review or approval, there are delays, and these delays would hinder trial initiation and progression as well. With regards to infrastructure, we usually have very limited resources. So you have diagnostic challenges. Our laboratories are not well equipped to that standard as well. So then it makes data quality and integrity to be questionable. Access to post-trial treatment too is another challenge that we face when it comes to infrastructure-related facilities. At a patient level, it's more of a cultural, a sociocultural thing, where patients will have their own issues with regards to the clinical trials, cultural misconceptions concerning some of these things. And then we also have adherence issues where patients might adhere to your treatment at one point, and then at another point, they want to try out a traditional medicine, which ideally they shouldn't have some of these things to do. So these are multiple barriers that we need to overcome and we need to work on as a continent, and then to overcome and get clinical trials moving on. So how do we overcome some of these things? We need to strengthen our infrastructure by improving our facilities, by making sure that our regulatory frameworks are streamlined. And then we should also try to establish ethics committees that are centralized as well. We could also increase awareness by doing community engagements, sensitizing our patients in terms of their cultural beliefs, forming patient advocacy groups so that individuals who offer treatment could actually be their own spokesperson and get people to be interested in some of these clinical trials and the benefits that are associated with it. We should also foster some form of partnerships with ourselves. Africa should learn to work with itself. Countries within Africa should be working with itself. But somehow we seem not to be taking that to our advantage as well. We should have a lot of public-private initiatives. It's being done in Ghana, where you have private labs working with public institutions to ensure that patient turnover is faster. Patients, if we want to carry out some researches, they help us to carry out some of these researches as well. And then we could also consider academic industry alliances or partnerships. Universities with the pharma companies could actually come together, or the pharma companies with private could also work together to get some of these things moving on. And then the final bit that we could also look at is to look at our local talents. We should train more people, get more people interested in oncology, not necessarily become oncology nurses or doctors, but they should be scientists who are interested in oncology research. There should be data experts who are also interested in oncology research as well, so that we can help develop solutions to our problems as well. And then we should have retention incentives, because if you train the people and they are not motivated to stay, they are likely to move to better, like countries that are going to offer them better opportunities. So we conclude by saying that inclusive research indeed is important for Africa to be involved in, but we need to have our own local leadership taking the initiative to ensure that whatever we find out is relevant to our population and is something that is going to improve our patients' outcome. And we can take, with our local leadership being the one taking the lead, we could involve global collaboration and partnership to lead to this researches and clinical trials being something that can be long-term commitments. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Edwina. That was quite insightful. For me, the major thing that struck out was the fact that we as Africans, we need to have our own research expertise here, because our DNAs are different, our structures are different, and we need to be able to formalize or structure things that are best suited to us. So just a few questions, just so that we can better understand the lovely presentation that you've given. So definitely, it's important that we have these clinical trials, and it's important that there are priorities. And so, when we're initiating these clinical trials, especially in the African region, what do you perceive are some of the priorities or the most important things that need to be looked out for while starting these clinical trials?
So is we building our capacity in terms of our human resource is creating the right ecosystem, and the right ecosystem starts with you creating the human resource and then developing infrastructure. But then whilst we are waiting to have some of these things going on, we have real evidence actually in our practices. So for instance, you have companies that have sponsored treatment and have gotten some treatment to be available to the African population. Since we're already treating patients with some of these things, we could actually put out some of these data out there, because then it becomes our own research papers that we are putting out there. And then it gives us some visibility, and people get to become aware that indeed these people are capable of doing their own research, their everyday evidence that they have in their clinic, whilst we work on building the human resource and building infrastructure as well.
Hello, Edwina. Okay, we lost you for a little bit. So if you can kindly, I think you had gotten to the part where you were speaking on the importance of infrastructure and then building our own infrastructure. Hello.
On our human resource,
Yeah.
building capacity by improving our infrastructure. So our facilities that we are working at doesn't need to be something extraordinary. Evidence that we have in our clinical practice should also be something that we should put out there for the world to know that we are capable of carrying out some basic research as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Edwina. Indeed, the world should know that Africa is capable of carrying out its own research, and we have the means to be able to do that, despite the limited resources that we have. But irrespective of that, we have to start somewhere, and that is what we are doing. So collaboration definitely is important. We will need to be able to collaborate with our international counterparts, since, to put things into perspective, they are far ahead in terms of research into fields, especially cancer. So how do we manage collaborations, and how do these collaborations play a key role in trials in Africa? How do we harness these collaborations and make the best out of collaborating with our international counterparts, just so that we can get the best from Africa for us?
So like I did say earlier, if we don't put out our own data out there, it's difficult for someone to actually believe in you when you are not also putting yourself out there. So we need to look at our regulations, and these are basic things that we could all do. Like the hospital can improve their ethical review time to make research more easily done within a particular facility. We don't need to wait for about a month or something before you get ethical approval for your research to go on, for you to be able to initiate your research. Or whilst you're collecting your data, your research approval hasn't been done. We also need to be able to work with, like, apply for grants. Our own government should be able to give us grants that we can use for research work. Or we should, as a facility, be conscious about building those grants or making those grants accessible to our people. Again, we could also, sorry, just a minute. I'm running low. And then our international partners, our work with them shouldn't be about them just funding us. It's about we also building capacity. So they fund you, you get the data, they send the data, we know. That's not where we should work at. Now we should do global collaboration in such a way that whatever information we get out of the research is for Africans, with African being the leaders of that research work going on. So that's how our global collaboration should look at, and then it helps us build our own capacity with us as the leaders, and then the collaborators just being collaborators for the work we are doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much, Edwina. And the final question, for this to be sustainable, we need to be able to have young Africans show interest in research. How are we able to make sure that at least we have these African researchers involved, and how can they be effectively mentored? Because mentorship is extremely important to pique interest so that there can be that sustainability. How do we get these young African researchers involved, and then how do we mentor them so that we can sustain or continue this good work
So
that
our training institutions should actually consider making research a requirement in part of the training that we give. So in medical school, in the laboratory training schools, with the radiology training school, the radiography training schools, research should be part of it. We should encourage individuals to also carry out some mini projects. It doesn't need to be something elaborate. UCC SMS does very well with something like that, where students are encouraged to do mini projects every year. And so as you are going along, you realize that you have a lot of interest in research. Those who have interest in research kind of start working at it whilst they are in house job, whilst they are doing medical job. They are able to still carry out a few researches here and there. And then when they get an individual or a mentor who is willing to kind of guide them to, they are able to do that. And aside carrying out, like making it part of our training program, we should also make mentorship part of our everyday training of our young scientists. So whether in school, whether at the workplace, there should be some mentor who helps the individual to carry out some of these things and guide them in being able to develop their capacity with regards to research.
All right. Thank you so much, Edwina. That was beautifully put. I think for me, I've learned a lot, and the importance of having we as Africans be extremely involved in research, especially regarding oncology and basically cancer issues. International collaborations, as you have mentioned, is important, but we need to be able to harness that significantly to benefit us by making sure we do what is necessary. And mentorship for the young African researcher is also important. We can get that in motion by involving the schools, basically having them interested at that very early stage. So thank you so much, Edwina. That was very much appreciated. So let's not waste too much time. We'll go to our next speaker, Dr. Soji Tete. So our next speaker is Dr. Soji Tete. He is a health policy expert with a strong focus on health systems governance and clinical trial regulations. Dr. Soji Tete will provide us with a much needed perspective on the importance of strengthening governance and regulatory frameworks for clinical trials in Africa. So Dr. Soji, is it Tete? Yes. Please, the floor is yours, and we would very much be delighted to listen to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atipui. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, I can. So I believe everyone else should be able to.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just want to start by thanking you for this opportunity. I know you've put in a lot of effort into putting the session together. And I hope that at the end of the day, participants are able to get the needed information from it. I collaborated quite extensively with the Food and Drugs Authority to put this together. So you would see that a lot of their logos are all over the place. For some reason, my slides are not moving. Okay, I think I will stop and reshare because it's not responding.
Yeah,
All
right. That might be a good idea. Thank you.
Yeah. So, by way of an outline for the presentation, I'm going to be talking about what we really mean when we talk about the ethical frameworks and the oversight that is required, and how we as Africans can adopt some of the best practices from global standards. I mean, in Edwina's presentation, I think she drew attention to some of the challenges on the continent in terms of governance and the regulatory framework, and then how we also get funding to be able to undertake some of these activities. And then I would end by looking at global regulatory practices and how they can guide the activities of the national regulatory authorities. In terms of the ethical frameworks and the oversight, I mean, when we talk about clinical trials, we are talking about testing out interventions, whether they are devices, whether they are vaccines, whether they are medications in human participants. So sometimes that would involve people who are vulnerable, people who have offered themselves voluntarily to, be used to test the efficacy of some of these medications. So because it involves human beings, it's important that we have clear guidance as to what are their rights, what can they expect, how do we monitor for safety incidents, and how can we respect their dignity as human beings. So you would find that many people will make reference to, let's say, the Declaration of Helsinki put out by the World Medical Association that really calls out the things to look out for. What information do you give to the patient to be able to get their consent? How do you educate them on the risk associated with the medications that they will take? How do they look out for danger signs, and so on and so forth. So these are the basic underpinnings. And then that is why various bodies are then brought about to make sure that we follow some standard protocols to ensure that, the human dignity, the subjects that are being used are accorded the necessary respect to also be able to protect them. So in many places, you would have these ethical committees and IRBs, the institutional review boards, who would study your whole protocol that you're going to use for your clinical trial and make sure that, at least on a scientific basis, it makes sense for what you're intending to do. And they are often positioned as independent from those actually undertaking the study. So it's not the people who are doing the study who would review it themselves. And then they also ensure that indeed there is social good to what it is that you are trying to test out. And any unethical practices, for example, you're not informing people about potential harm from the intervention that you are going to test, would not be admitted. And then also in instances where you are going to administer placebo, where there's a clear proven benefit there's a clear proven treatment to whatever condition there is, then it's like you're just experimenting for the sake of experimenting. In that case, it's seen to be unethical and they would not agree for you to go ahead. When one talks about governance, we are talking about the various structures that we create and the various roles and responsibilities that come with those structures to ensure that the integrity, the ethical practices are maintained. So to make sure that there is transparency in terms of what data is being collected and for what purpose, that we apply the same yardstick to each application that comes through in compliance with our national regulations. So if you take a place like Ghana, for example, I mean, we've created the Food and Drugs Authority that has the mandate to exercise regulatory function over clinical trials. And then they are under the Ministry of Health, so the ministry can hold them accountable and be very clear that they are performing the functions that have been given. Ultimately, the ministry would also have to answer to the Parliamentary Select Committee on Health. So these are sort of structures that are created to make sure that the issues of consistency in decision-making, transparency, and all of those things are adhered to. And in Africa, it's particularly relevant because if you may know that in terms of the history of clinical trials, there's been a lot of mistrust even during COVID and prior to COVID. In some places, there's this whole vaccine hesitancy that exists in certain communities, in spite of our very high immunization levels. People believe that these trials are there to make people infertile, to reduce the African population, and so on and so forth. So when that is complicated by the lack of clear regulatory functions, it makes it a bit difficult to be able to undertake the studies. And in the midst of COVID, I recall that the University of Health and Allied Sciences wanted to do some vaccine trials, and Ghana has the track record of doing it. But there was this whole uproar about people in the region being experimented with and so on and so forth. And that brought the whole investment to a halt. So it is important that we are very clear about the unique context here and build the relevant capacity to be able to conduct it, especially within our populations. Yes, we do want to innovate, but without clear guidelines and also proper communication and interactions with the various publics, it becomes somewhat difficult to be able to take it through. Now, I wanted to focus a little bit about global best practices and the fact that it's important to also tailor it to your local context. So I've spoken about some of the global standards. I've talked about the Declaration of Helsinki and how all of these rules and regulations set the ethical and operational benchmarks for the clinical trials. And so they would give you guidance on how you design your study, how your consent form should be designed, the information requirements in terms of how you solicit the consent of the patient. They would have clear guidance on protocols on how you monitor for any adverse or safety incidents once you start your study, and how you should keep your data without fudging the data to be able to give you the outcome that you're looking for. All of these things are there. But then when you come into Africa, yes, you are expected to stick, to a large part the same principles. But then sometimes you are confronted with the realities of the capacity of the health system. So how do you work within the constraints of the staff that you have? When you are translating the informed consent, how much attention should you pay to it to ensure that the actual meaning of what is intended is actually well interpreted, so that you do not miscommunicate in terms of what you want to do. In terms of also the data infrastructure, if you are collecting large data sets, do you have the requisite infrastructure to be able to collect it? And how do you maintain the cleanliness of the data? Do you have the people with the capacity to be able to help you with your analysis? You have to reflect on your system to be able to do all of that, whilst you're maintaining those global best practices. So it's there, and then you use it to guide your interventions locally. The point being that they are principles, and it's not like it's the Bible. You cannot depart from it or rigid templates, but you use it to guide and to achieve that balance in terms of what is globally ideal and then what is locally desirable without compromising on the standards. And here, this is where it becomes important to build the capacity of various people, because there are people with clear roles. So the regulators in the space, the ethical committees that need to be set up, those who are conducting the investigations, those with community engagement skills that can build the relevant trust. All of these things have to be factored in. I mean, in some places, there will not have to be the need to translate any study protocol or translate it into any other language. It's just what it is. So all of the people who are going to be trained to actually do the community entry well in such a way that you get the outcomes that you want. Edwina was talking about the fact that people will mix herbal medication and whatever intervention that you are testing. We also know about instances, and this is not with particular reference to Africa, where people in instances where people are given some reward for taking part in trials, they would jump from community to community, one trial after another. This becomes their profession. And so you can imagine that you are receiving an intervention on one side, a placebo in another side, and then you just jump to the next city to take the shot. So the results certainly cannot be relied upon. Now, once you take these interventions in place, you build the capacity, you train people, you clarify roles, it then builds a lot of confidence in what you're doing locally. And then it also ensures that the design is effective in that the results can be relied upon. And then also, I've heard a lot of talk about building confidence in African research to get the results that we require. These are the steps that we can take to make sure that that really is the case. And it also helps once you've taken these measures to be able to attract the relevant funding, because then you do have the systems, the processes in place. You can assure a high level of integrity of your design. So then you can attract the necessary funding to be able to undertake, because you demonstrate that you can exercise the relevant regulatory efficiency. Other than that, nobody really is interested in funding it, because we can never really be sure of the results that you are coming out with. Then I'll just dwell briefly on the foundations of the governance and regulatory frameworks. So one is the fact that there needs to be a law that clarifies all this. So it's not just some agency that has been put up with a handful of people doing what they like. There should be a clear law, that mandates you with your roles, your governance structures, your board, your reporting lines, all set up, very, very clear. And then also there should be what we call, let's say, a legislative instrument, which then operationalizes it. In Ghana, for example, if you're going to charge, you're not just going to charge based on your whims. Once you determine the amount that you need to charge to make you operational, you do need to seek parliamentary approval, and that all of those things will be clarified in your legislative instruments, the processes for application, and so on and so forth. So it brings legitimacy to your activities, and then you also know that you are not working in a silo. You are accountable to some authorities. So in terms of the structures, these laws will clarify who or what the National Regulatory Authority is. They review the study protocols, those the technical people who review it. We set up these ethics committees. They would be looking out for the patient interest, the safety, the rights, that the patient's health and are not compromised. Then we have bodies like continental bodies like African Vaccine Regulatory Forum. They would help, attracting resources to be able to build capacity and making sure that we are adhering to standards across the continent in terms of the regulatory authorities. So they would have fora where they would compare notes, they will build capacity, and so on and so forth. And similarly, you would have the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry where the data is kept, and then we ensure that visibility is brought to what is being generated. Later on, I'll speak a little bit about artificial intelligence and how we can tap into some of these data sets. Similarly, we talk about sustainable funding mechanism. All of this requires money, but the good thing is that once you have the law, once you have your LI in place, well, it's not always easy to get the LI, but once you have it in place, it's then possible for you to then be charging for these services. So I know, for example, that the last time I checked in Ghana, they were charging something in the region of 15,000 US for your application. This is then used to recruit and train qualified personnel to help with their public engagement, their inspections, and all of that, and to run the bureaucracy. It's also important that they have clarity in terms of their strategic plan. For example, you may start off doing one thing. Now Ghana is talking about local vaccines manufacturing. And we've just come to understand that the regulatory space for vaccines is totally different. So we need to build additional capacity. So you would factor that into the way you do things. Also, we have WHO maturity levels, and Ghana is now at maturity level 3 for medicines regulation. But it wasn't always the case. So your strategic plan will carve out your growth trajectory, for example, and then you can grow accordingly. And then in terms of the finalization and implementation of the plan, of course, the usual, apart from the resources, building the capacity continuously, because there are things that may not be in place. And this is where it's important to learn from others. You talked about South Africa, you talked about Egypt. Tunisia also has a strong regulatory framework. Ghana, certainly, we are the only country in West Africa, I think the first country in West Africa to have achieved maturity level 3 at WHO. So a lot going on. So that whole Africa continental body that brings this together enables peer-to-peer learning, so that we can align our efforts and support one another. As we talk a lot about vaccines, vaccine trials and manufacturing of vaccines, I know that there's some conversation at the level of the Africa CDC to create some continental regulatory agency, because you've talked about building confidence. There are sometimes rules where people will talk about, once you've gone through the trials, once you say the vaccine works, once we want to go and manufacture, then it is linked to WHO pre-qualification, which is a high standard. And sometimes it's bureaucratic, it takes a very long time. So if we build sufficiently robust systems and that gain the attention and the respect of the global community, then we are fairly certain that when we manufacture, or once we've done our clinical trials and once we are manufacturing, then there's confidence that we can be able to market even outside of the continent, which is why these matters of governance, ethics, and regulations are very, very critical. I've spoken a lot about the regulations that operationalize the legal framework, so I will not dwell too much on that again. The human resource cannot be overstated, because it's about whether you have the capacity and the staff with the requisite expertise to be able to review the protocol and understand the scientific imperatives and the proposals that are contained in there. So a different range of scientists. People that sometimes will go out there and inspect the sites. That you have the equipment and understand how these equipment work and whether they can do what they are purporting to do in your study protocol, whether you have sufficiently trained data managers and so on and so forth. So the regulator must invest in these things so that you can check what the scientists are proposed to be able to do. And then, of course, in addition, providing ongoing training and then professional development. The fiscal infrastructure is also very critical. It's about investing in the office space, IT systems, transportation for inspections, and so on and so forth. QMS, I would focus more on the fact that this has to do with humans. And so you do need to have a quality management system to be able to track the data that is being collected, how safety interventions are being tracked, how reporting is being done in a very transparent manner, so that we have confidence in the study protocol. They've talked about WHO global benchmarking to maturity levels. So depending on how robust your systems are for tracking the various stages, you can then ascend. And as I've mentioned, Ghana is at maturity level 3. When it comes to the electronic and the artificial intelligence, which are two key components for strengthening the regulatory framework, is critical, because there are these various elements that you are, considering, you are collecting data on: the pharmacovigilance, how you reviewed the inspections. So is your electronic database set up in such a way that you are able to link the various phases of the work? Is it so easy that we can quickly share the data with the ethics committee, the external partners, so that, again, it builds confidence. It makes it easy to track the process. I was speaking to somebody in Abu Dhabi recently, somebody who does a lot of clinical trials, and we were talking about the fact that the Kenyan process is very robust. The timelines are all known. You load everything online, and as they track, they just tell you what they are doing at each point, how long it's going to take each phase. So it's just very interesting for them. So that's where one must then invest in the electronic database. Then there's also the AI bit. And I've talked about all of these data sets. So if we end up in a situation where all of the regulatory authorities in Africa, say, are somehow interlinked, then you have large data sets. And so then you can use the artificial intelligence that can then begin to look at all of the trends, can help you with decision support for benefit risk analysis. So for example, when this was tried here, these were some of the common side effects. Some were fatal, that were not fatal. You're not waiting for somebody to come and report, but AI can simply do the quick analysis for you. Then the last bit of the presentation, where I'm going to focus on good regulatory practices and how we can apply them to the national regulatory authorities. That's a broad term, but in Ghana, that NRA is the Food and Drugs Authority. But this will be more of a summary of many of the points that I've said, because the aim there is to ensure that there's transparency, accountability, and efficiency in the way in which we operate using the good regulatory practices. So what are those internationally recognized standards? Checking out the legal considerations for how we are set up, clarifying the scope of your authority with a clear mandate to enforce and sometimes even sanction and to bring some of the processes to a halt. And what are the remedies for appeal when these things happen? So then you have a legal basis for that. Then there's also the ethical considerations. Again, given the fundamental human rights are not being compromised in enforcement, looking at the vulnerable population so that it's not like you go and hide in some village, people who are poor, people who are not educated, or people who do not know that they are potential dangers and who do not have the freedom to volunteer to be a part of it. So the NRAs would promote that and also ensure that they weigh there is, for example, if your intervention is going to result in deaths, then it's not something that we're going to continue. So yes, somebody has to be on the lookout so that we can reinforce public trust. And then, as always, there may be operational challenges. So for good regulatory practices to make sure that those challenges that we are facing in terms of human resources, building their capacity, making sure that we have the right people with the technical know-how to be able to do it, we invest in them. And I've said a fair bit about the digital infrastructure, so making sure that those ones too are in place to be able to administer the good regulatory practices. And also the matter of stakeholder involvement and public consultation. Indeed, using my own example within the National Vaccine Institute, we've mapped out 8 regions. And we've started some community sensitization and awareness engagements. And the idea is that you need to build confidence. You need to prepare the minds of the people because, yes, we're doing well with the immunization. But as we saw in the case in the Volta region, one bad report can spoil a number of things. And sometimes we do not even engage the media even well, because they, if they are ignorant about it, if they think people are being harmed, if they pick a report and they don't understand well, then it becomes a whole thing. By the time you try and do damage control, your whole protocol comes to a halt. So being able to map out the various community stakeholders and engaging them appropriately to get the requisite support is critical. And then there's the bit about the fact that the protocols sometimes are testing data that or interventions that companies have gathered a lot of information on. So it's sort of private and confidential. So you are weighing the balance between being transparent, holding them accountable, and then also sharing commercial secrets in terms of intellectual property and all of that. So your policies or our policies as regulators will have to clarify what needs to be protected, what information can be shared, what can be published, and in the interest of the public. So you may create all of the registries, you may create what what the tests are about, what they are looking out for, and so on and so forth, some of the highlights of the results without necessarily sharing proprietary information. Again, I'm calling out good regulatory practices. So I'll just end here and say a big thank you for the opportunity. And my apologies that I may not be able to stay through to the end, but I look forward to connecting later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saji. We very much appreciate the insight. It was quite insightful, but since you said you will not be able to stay through to the end, I hope you're available for just 2 questions. Okay, well, so listening in, for me, my concerns was the bureaucracy. I mean, we're not too keen on, or we don't have a legislative instrument. You did speak about the legislative instrument and the law, but these can be quite bureaucratic. So how then do we maneuver these processes to ensure that that does not become a limiting factor to starting clinical trials here in Africa?
I think you are spot on. You in many places you would have the acts passed by the parliament, and then the process of developing the legislative instrument becomes so tedious and cumbersome. I think we have opportunity to learn from one another. Certainly, there are those who have scaled that hurdle and can share whatever acts, whatever allies that they have in place. Also, we would be able to develop organizational policies, that we can then start operating with sometimes in advance of the LI. I know some national regulatory authorities that have functioned for years. It's not illegal. It is just that you haven't been able to systematically call out the functions and how you are going to perform it after you to operationalize the act. So it results in some sort of ad hoc behavior, but certainly you can make the policies as you go along, which is not necessarily very ideal. And then sometimes too, you can import expertise. So if you want to go into a new area, you might let's say go to SA and bring people in who have done it before to support you to be able to do that. But fortunately, as I said, in the case of Ghana, the FDA is quite pretty advanced in this. It's only in the area of vaccine regulation that we are building a lot of capacity and doing some of these things in collaboration with other countries.
Well, that's soothing to hear, at least that in Ghana we are far advanced and would be able to navigate or maneuver some of these bureaucratic proceeds. The other issue is regarding AI. I mean, AI is here to stay. We know a lot about AI, and definitely AI can be quite beneficial, as well as it does have its own negatives. How do we incorporate AI in terms of making sure that the patient or the client, their dignity is preserved, as well as the responsibilities of the clinicians or the researchers is also much taken care of?
I think we have to go back to first principles. So the matter of, I spoke a lot about informed consent. I don't think I said a lot about confidentiality and de-identifying the patient. So we don't know the identities of the patient. So that information is not out there. And because AI sort of relies on information that you put out there. So making sure that we stick to these things and then we don't put out that information. If it's about analyzing trends, the data and so on and so forth, yes, making sure that we put out the accurate information that we are comfortable to put out there. And then also linking up with other African countries or even in other places. We've talked about our own genetic variety to make sure that we are leveraging not just what is going on in Ghana, but across the continent so that we sort of maximize the output. But again, making sure that the patient identities are being, protected. I think you're muted, Vanessa.
Oh, Yes, that's true. Thank you for prompting me. So I was just basically saying thank you for the insight and the education that you have given. The African clinical trials cannot continue or proceed without proper ethics and proper regulation. Giving us this insight has been quite beneficial. So thank you for joining in.
I'm sorry that I have to leave. I will connect later on.
Sorry, Dr. Saji, not so quick. I'll just ask. This could be a quick opportunity for anybody who would like to ask any question to kindly ask now, just while he's still here. Anybody in the audience who has any pressing questions for Dr. Saji?
Mm-hmm.
Like an itch that has to be scratched. Okay, Dr. Saji, we won't hold you any longer. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So to continue the conversations, our next speaker is Prof. Kafui Akakpo. Definitely, pathology is imperative, it's important, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Kafui Akakpo, who is a distinguished consultant pathologist, and he will share insights on the role of pathology in supporting clinical trials, particularly in low-risk settings. So I'll just quickly go to Prof. Akakpo, and if you are on, you please share. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. So I think this is my second time presenting here, and I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, yes, we can.
Good.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, do you mind?
So my presentation is on the role of pathology in supporting clinical trials in Africa. And listening to the earlier presenters, one thing that becomes important for us to emphasize is what is a clinical trial in the first place? I'm sure we all get what it means and what it's about, but we need to understand the utility of pathology reports in clinical trials. So why pathology in clinical trials? And that's one thing that I would want us to understand by the time I finish with my presentation. I would also want us to know the quality indices of pathology reporting, because without quality in pathology reporting, you really would not be able to use a pathology report for what you want to use it for, which is a clinical trial. And through that, I hope that we can examine the quality of reports that we have and see how we can improve that. Then I'll go into how we can help ourselves improve the pathology services that we have now and go into biobanking, just a bit of biobanking. So definition-wise, we're saying a clinical trial is a research study. So that's one of the things that I want to make clear, that it's a research that we're going to have to carry out. And it's got many rules that are supposed to guide that particular kind of research. And of course, it's in a clinical setting. So that encapsulates what a clinical trial is. And usually it's innovative in the sense that it is not the usual thing that we're doing in the clinic. It's introducing new things into our clinical practice. And that's why we even need to do it, because it's not routine, it's not the usual. Then one of the other things that I want us to also pay attention to is what they call a pragmatic clinical trial. So though it looks like a clinical trial, in fact it is, unlike traditional explanatory clinical trials, which focus on proving causation in ideal circumstances, for a pragmatic clinical trial, you're looking at real world settings, okay, everyday settings. And so a lot of the time, it's something that we don't pay attention to when it comes, we don't usually think that as we practice going on every day, we are generating enough information to inform research. But one of the things that I want us to keep reminding ourselves is the fact that medicine itself is inherently experimental. And so if you paid attention to the inherent experimental nature of medicine, you probably would be getting a lot of information as you go along, instead of thinking that it's just clinical practice, clinical practice. In actual fact, you're doing some form of research, but it is just that you haven't classified it as such. And so you lose a lot of information just by the way you capture whatever information you are getting out of your clinical practice. Pathology is central. If you do not have a criteria for admitting patients into your clinical trial or subjects into your clinical trial, then you can't even start a clinical trial. So for many of the clinical trials, we can't even get in there because we don't have the diagnostics. It doesn't cut it. Our diagnostics is very basic. You're talking about breast cancer, and all you're doing is triple negative breast cancer. I mean, people are looking at mutations associated with breast cancer. So if your diagnostics doesn't cut it, you would not qualify to even go in there in the first place. So a number of things happen. You want to know what therapy, and if you get to know what therapy, the cancer type, the site, then you are looking at grouping of the cancer. What stage? Are we stage matching? All these things are done in pathology, of course, with other clinical investigations supporting. Then you look at molecular studies, NGS, PCR, biomarker testing, IHC. You do all that so that you subgroup and subcategorize the people. Then, of course, when you have done all this and you have decided that this patient qualifies for a clinical trial because he's got the diagnostics, you have to look at the outcome of the clinical trial. There are things that you're going to be measuring which actually relate to the outcome of the trial, and a number of them would be pathology based. And so again, your pathology must cut it. You must have a good system in place to be able to track what is happening to a patient, and without good pathology services, you can't do that. Then the extreme end is when you're looking at data, and all this I've been talking about is data. You put a patient on medications, you expect an outcome. The outcome that you have been waiting for, you have to capture it in the form of data. And so we need to start looking at the work that we're doing as pathologists as data. And of course, generally as clinicians, we need to do that. Then of course, there's biobanking, but I put these outside the circle of pathology, but these are in pathology and they're very important. Now, this is one of my favorite phrases that I like to use. So I say that if you have read The Emperor of All Maladies before, there's one guy who says this, and he says that no matter how voluminous experience is, okay, it cannot be employed as a sensitive indicator of scientific validity. What is important is that, yes, in God we trust, but all of us must have data. You must just have the data. We can't just believe you because you've been around for so long. There must be some data backing why we must do things the way you think we must do them. So we look at pathology quality, and in terms of quality in pathology, yes, you look at it, it's a tortoise thing. You kind of expect A to B, but in reality, what it is this complicated loop of things that you have to do in the center before you get to the last end, which is the B. Okay. Now, what do you need from the pathologist for a clinical trial, a pragmatic clinical trial? How detailed should the diagnosis be? Is it just an H&E diagnosis? Of course, that won't work. Special stains, it won't work. IHC alone, maybe. But molecular is most of the time what is needed to be able to categorize the patient well enough for that patient to benefit from a clinical trial or to join, to be recruited. Now, when do we need that information? How quickly? Do you want to wait for 1 month before you get that report and then go on to enroll the patient? You may not have that time, okay? How do we want the information communicated? It must be crisp and clear. We don't want tortuous, convoluted communication because the clinical trial is specific. It has a definite timeline. There's a lot of money involved, and things must be done in a clear manner, okay? So if we want the information that we have put in or we've stored after the patient has received the medication and we've observed and tested and all that, how do we want to save that information so that we can get it out when we need it? All that must be well thought through before we even start. Now, the other thing that is important in our setting, which most of the time we talk about, is how do we homogenize reporting standards to ensure that despite the lack of subspecialty training, all pathologists report like pros. So I am not a breast pathologist, but I can bet my last dollar that if I reported a breast specimen, you would not be able to tell the difference between me and somebody in the US who reports a breast specimen, because what is important would be captured. And that's how it should be. You don't want to be able to tell the difference between two pathologists because one is a pro and the other one is not. In our setting, we don't even have that luxury because nobody in reality is a pro. All of us are doing general and we have to report everything. So we must have the skill to report as pros, despite the fact that we are not trained to report as pro. What it means is that we must have a system, a structure that allows pathologists to report in that manner. Then, of course, biomaterial is important. Without the right biomaterial, you're not going to get anywhere. What it means is that you're going to do biobanking. But if you are saving material that is not good for molecular studies, then you shouldn't even start, because effectively what you are doing is wasting time and space and the resources that are available, which you could have used for something else. So if you want a good biobank, you want good molecular studies or outcomes, you must have good biomaterial. Okay. So what is needed for this PCT? So you need enough information that allows recruitment of a patient to receive novel or unique therapy. The information must be of good quality and it must be reproducible across all sites. The information must be good for that research, and clinical trials, we say we accept that. So what information do you need? You categorize the information like you have to categorize pathology reports, core data elements. These are essential, mandatory. They've got conditional data elements, optional data elements. And you also have this issue of research protocol versus real world data. They merge together if you do them very well, because whatever is required for a research protocol, it is aimed at ensuring that the patient outcomes improve. So eventually it will become real world data. So what it means is that real world data has already been researched and proven to be important, and therefore you should probably not be, in fact, not probably, you should not be playing with it because it is important data. Okay, so you somehow find a way of bridging that gap. And for many of these, they've got guidelines. And so when you get your clinical trial, the protocol will be there. There will be guidelines that you have to follow, and we must all learn to follow that. It will also include protocols for even biobanking, which we must follow. Now, generally, what I have said, what I've been trying to push across is this. Pathology report must be accurate, complete, and timely, and it must be usable. In this setting, it must be usable for your clinical trial or a pragmatic clinical trial, or whatever you want to use it for, which means that you must capture all that is needed. You must produce it in the right way that is easily readable. Then it must be timely, and it must be stored in a manner that is good enough so that later when you want it, you can bring it back. Now, it begins to appear as if these are complicated, but these are not really complicated. These are basic things that every system that is worth a salt or wants to make a difference must guarantee. This, our current state, which is what I said I'll draw attention to. Our current state is really nice English spoken in a pathology report. Sections show an invasive carcinoma infiltrating a desmoplastic stroma as tongues and nest of markedly pleomorphic cells, score 3, with 15 mitotic figures and all that. You go on and on about it. All the things that I've colored are important items. They are mandatory. Okay, so you put all of them in the description. This is a narrative report. So if you give the chance to people who have different levels of ability to speak English, you will see the differences showing up. It doesn't take a long time for you to notice. So that same report is captured here. It says sections show fragments of breast tissue with an invasive carcinoma growing as large pleomorphic cells, forming syncytial islands and interspersed with lymphocytes. It omits all the other things about tubal formation and all used into brackets 3 and all that, and then just goes to the conclusion grade 3. Okay, so this is what you see, and across board, these reports demonstrate that. Now, for some of them, you get to that point where you don't know what to use a report for. So this is a good example. Sections of suspicious area shows fibrosis with lymphohistiocytic infiltrates. No viable tumor cells are seen. Lymph nodes, a tumor or chemotherapy changes, induced changes are seen. So you're now wondering, is it chemotherapy or is it actually tumor? And the pathologist has not come out clear on this. So if you get a report like this, you don't know what to use it for. Effectively, it's not a usable report. So the point is, where we are now, we need to move to a point where pathology reports are accurate, complete, timely, and usable. And usability must be the key thing that we look at when we come to clinical trials in our setting, because the pathology report must just be usable for that purpose. Now, I propose, and I have proposed this for a very long time now, I'm becoming a broken record now. Synoptic reporting is what I believe has got the solution, is the solution to some of our problems. Synoptic reporting just means this: paired data element response. So name, then you state your name. Age, then you state it. Margin, not involved. Distance from closest margin, 5 millimeters. That's how you do it. That's what they call a synoptic report. It's just a pure data response system. It does not mix a lot of descriptions with the core data elements. So all core data elements are separated, and then you can have a narrative under the report, but the core data elements are separate. So this is a good example of it. You got specimen, needle core biopsy, quadrant, lower, number of cores 10. You go on invasive carcinoma, tubal formation 3, nuclear polymorphism 3, and you state everything categorically. What this does is that it allows you to, at the end, be able to machine read this, get complete data, which can be analyzed in SPSS, Excel, because the data can just be it can just be exported to that format, because when you export it, all the fields come in columns with headings. Everything that was a data element with a response, you would have that data element at the top as the heading, and beneath that, the whole column will be populated with different patients' responses. So it makes life very easy. You don't need to read anything to underline things before you retrieve the data. From the beginning of the report to when the report is extracted for research, you are clear you are dealing with not just patient material that you just want to read like a storybook, but material that can become important in a clinical trial and its outcomes, and also inform clinical trials in a pragmatic clinical trial system. Okay, so it's got advantages, and it is a good example of a report like that. You just generate the report just comes in. Of course, I've deleted some of the fields to de-identify the patient, but you can look at some of the things that are there, and you can see that it's in Excel. Okay, got advantages, of course. For completeness, there's no doubt about it. Reports out there indicate that if you want completeness of a pathology report without omissions, 100% completeness, you guarantee with synoptic reporting. Okay. Then, of course, it improves timeliness a lot, because a lot of things are structured, and you don't need to go through volumes of reading to be able to make out errors. As an example, you could read very fast and you would not see chronic active prostatitis, and you would think you would see it's been typed at chronic active prostitutes, and you forget about it. You just let the report go. It is when the person who is reading it sees that, but you said chronic active prostitutes, then that they refer the thing back to you and say, it's prostatitis. But if you are picking out the various responses, then it's already embedded in there. So you don't make such errors, and you don't have the back and forth that is usually associated with old reports. Okay. So for me, my biggest point with synoptic reporting is one, and usually what I say is, in a system where you lack experts, giving them a structure to report allows all those who are not even experts to report like pros. What then happens is you don't notice a difference between the pathologies, because if it's breast, they are going according to a system. If it's prostate, they are going according to system. So your cancers are reported according to a system, and it makes life easy for everybody. Now, real world data I mentioned, and I mentioned real world evidence. Real world data, we all know, we call it big data. And it's huge. Data from sources other than traditional clinical trials. A clinical trial, of course, usually means that you have a small group of people, and small is measured. I use small in measured terms, like you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people, or even less, and that's what you are following, and a strict research environment. But in real world data, you're following groups of people on medications and receiving different kinds of care in a methodical manner over time. What that does is that it allows you to generate large data that can be used to inform the small group research that you're doing. And that is what they call a pragmatic clinical trial. And that is becoming increasingly more favored, because it allows for some tailoring that is based on evidence that is generated in the real world. Okay. And of course, it also it allows the complexities of all these things that we see in the world. The world is not really a research environment. It's very complicated. So when you have real world data and the real world scenario, it allows you to experience all those things. And that can be used to now simulate a system that is research based, which is controlled. Okay. So this is a big advantage. And pathologists are sitting on gold when they look at biopsies and report cancers and the features of all these cancers and do molecular studies and all that. If we have this in mind, it makes life easier for everybody. Our role is just to ensure that we have quality requests, we present quality tissue, and we give feedback. Now, accuracy is the last thing I want to deal with. And in that regard, I'll say pre-analytics. This is the soil where accuracy is planted. It is what determines what we get out of tissue presented to the pathology lab. If you don't observe quality pre-analytics, you're not going to get the right tissue for your biobank, and your test results will not come out as expected. You get a triple negative rate of 80%, and you're wondering why Ghanaians have so many triple negatives, and it's just because we have bad pre-analytics. The moment pre-analytics start improving, you notice that, oh, a significant proportion of our women actually do have hormone receptor positive breast cancer or HER2 amplified breast cancer and can benefit from some form of targeted therapy. So this is a breast cancer. Sampling it is important. Where you sample from, you get what you sample. You can get only fat, some tumor, all tumor, but you just need to know that this is the case when you're sampling. And to do that, you must remember what you're going to use your test for, which means you must be adequate. You must have adequate tissue when you sample. If you are in a clinical trial and the requirements for recruitment mean that you have to go all the way to BRCA1 and then BRCA2 testing or TP53 testing, start from H&E, ER, PR, PDL1, and then by the time you realize you've done so much on that biopsy. So if you have a few cores, you're not going to cut it. In this case, where you have 1, 2 cores versus when you have 3, 4 to 12 cores, the one who has a 3, 4, 12 course is going to get his patient quicker into the clinical trial versus the one, if you compare him to the person who has 1 or 2 cores, the 1 and 2 cores would not be able to go through all the tests. And if you're not able to go back, that patient can actually never be recruited into the clinical trial because he may not get the baseline labs that are required to get into the clinical trial. So to do this, we always say that if you want to get adequate tissue, enough, what you need to do is to follow protocol. If there's a clinical trial, the protocol must be followed. And pathologists would want you to follow that protocol to be able to get enough. When it comes to pathology, we also will follow the protocol. You can improve your the tissue that you're getting with visualization, whether it's ultrasound, CT. You can increase the number of cores from different places. You can move away from ulcers, necrotic tissue, and all that. And then the other thing is that a lot of the time when we want to get patients into clinical trials, we must be persistent. We must have some tenacity when it comes to negative results. We keep going and doing until we get all the results that we want to get the patients enrolled. Okay. Now, after good biopsy, the next thing is fixation. In a clinical trial, sometimes you may desire fresh tissue because some molecular studies require fresh tissue and not formalin fixed paraffin embedded tissue. So that has to be known before we get it there. That's our current state. Fixation is really has not been our headache in terms of paying attention to it. So we do get a lot of very rotten tissue that we cannot use for anything, and that we have to look at so that we don't have the situation where we've got different containers for different things and you just can't be certain what is getting to you. Now, this is a breast tissue that has been put in a glove. I saw the first one in 2010. In 2025, just 2 days ago, I saw another one. 15 years later, we've not gone anywhere. We just took a full circle. It's just like something just happened in Ghana and all containers for breast biopsy just disappeared. And then suddenly we went back to the glove again. It's like as if the ice age just came back, which was very strange to me because I was not expecting that it would happen again. But it did happen just 2 days ago. I saw the same thing, and it happened in Cape Coast Teaching Hospital. And the last one also happened in Cape Coast Teaching Hospital after 15 years. So you can imagine what we are doing to ourselves. Analytics, yes, we need to improve our analytics. At this stage, we are doing H&E special stains, IHC, ISH. There's PCR and NGS in some centers, but a lot of the diagnostics for clinical trials would rely on those things. And so we need to push a bit more. Of course, I always say that if you are in the setting of research, you can always get those. You can take advantage of research and get those done, PCR, NGS, because most of the time you have those in the research setting. However, it must be able to move into mainstream lab work because it is also important. And as I stated, if you are doing real world issues and you're moving, you want to get the right data, then these things should not be restricted to certain places. At least you must have some in regular routine practice. Biobanking, this is one of the most important things that has come up, and it varies in relation to the type of tissue or material, biological material that you're looking for. Blood, tissue, DNA from body fluids, and the tissue may be fresh or it may be formalin fixed, paraffin embedded. Formalin fixed, paraffin embedded tissue is the easiest to obtain now because we've got a lot of FFPE available because of our work. However, the issue is that the pre-analytics is usually not that great, so we can't use them much. Okay? Now, again, our role is in quality requests here. Quality tissue is very important, which means we must do good pre-analytics and we must engage actively. If you do not know, please ask. There's no need for you to shelve asking and then end up with a disaster. Okay. Thank you very much.
Look at me, sorry, my mic was off. Thank you very much, Prof. Akakbo. You have indeed touched significantly on the important role pathology plays in clinical trials, especially in our region. Now, what stood out to me was the need for consistency. And definitely, we don't have enough specialists. I think that is one of the limiting resources that we have here in our parts of the world. Let's bring it down to Ghana. The limited human resources, especially with specialists. What is the process in which we're able to mentor or at least have people have their interests peaked in specialties such as pathology to help gain some traction so we can properly advance in our clinical trials?
Well, thank you for that question. So there are a number of ways. Generally, it appears that a lot more people are interested in doing pathology training outside of Ghana instead of pathology training in Ghana. The reasons are clear to them and clear to us. And sometimes it is also because they don't see that, or they do not feel that the training system or the practice system is challenging enough. Probably would not see all the modern methods, and so you kind of feel handicapped in training. So to do that, what I say is that there are many ways of engaging those who are outside of Ghana to even support practice of the diagnostic practice in Ghana. There's the need for collaboration so that you have a seamless way of integrating pathologists who are from elsewhere or who are Ghanaians who are elsewhere with those who are in Ghana, so that you kind of find a way of using those who are in very well-resourced centers to support those who are in the under-resourced settings. In that regard, we've got digital pathology, we've got exchanges, all kinds of things that are going on to ensure that pathology practice elsewhere is brought to a resource-poor setting like ours. Of course, as we go along, we will pick up some of these things. When I was a resident, we were not even doing ER/PR HER2 for breast cancers routinely. Now, if you don't do it, in my opinion, it's criminal. And patients are getting all kinds of tests done for lung cancer, for targeted therapy and immunotherapy. In the days of my training, those were not done. So we are in a completely different era where we don't have any excuse not to do the right thing. If we don't have it, we partner others elsewhere to do it.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you. This is a different era, and we basically have the resources available to us so long as we avail ourselves to use the right resources to ensure that the right decisions are made. So not to take too much of your time, I'd want to say thank you for giving us this insightful presentation, and I'm sure if there's anybody in the audience that would want to ask a question or two, we would allow the floor for about 5 minutes so that we can have those questions asked so we don't take too much of everybody's time. We have one more presentation and we wouldn't want to take too much time. So if there's any question from the listeners, the audience, please do feel free to put it in the chat box and then Prof can answer it. Thank you. I think everyone is pretty much eager to go into the breakout sessions. I am very eager on that, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more questions in those breakout sessions. So let's not take too much time. I would introduce our last speaker for today, who is in the person of Dr. Philip Anderson. He is a health strategist with deep expertise in designing resilient health systems. Dr. Anderson will discuss how we can build sustainable ecosystems to support oncology clinical trials across Africa. So Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for joining us, and we're excited to hear from you. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Tupi. Can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Good. Let me share my screen.
Perfect.
Can you see my screen?
Unfortunately, we can't see your screen, so I don't know, but we can see you though, but not your screen. All right, great. Yes, your screen is being shared now.
Okay. Yeah, so I listened to Edwina's presentation, Dr. Soji and Kafui's, and I think they've done most of the work. I don't have much to do. My talk will be biased from the perspective of private sector sponsor when it comes to clinical trials and the view of Africa, or why and how we see Africa and the clinical trials on the continent. Unfortunately, like Dr. Good, it's moving now. Yeah. So this is what we call the paradox of Africa. And Africa is a continent. I'm sure you must have seen this: 25% of global disease burden, 18% of the world's population. But the downsides is that only 3% of the worldwide clinical trials is happening in Africa. And the worst thing is that only 2% of global analyzed genomic data is that of Africans, albeit we have a very diverse genomic background. And so clearly you will see that the disease burden in the population is not reflected in how much contribution Africans have in clinical trial. And what that means is that medicines that are produced by companies like what I work for, the biotech industry and all, are not tailored for the needs of African patients. Or otherwise, African patients might end up not responding the same way as the populations on which the medicines are developed per their clinical genomes. Now, like I said, we have a very uneven distribution of clinical trials, even on the continent. And few countries like South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt, yes, they have made significant strides in clinical trials, but many others are still left behind because they are fragmented regulatory systems. And I listened to Dr. Soji, and indeed, Ghana is one of the countries where our health authority, the Ghana FDA, has really progressed into maturity when it comes to clinical trials, but that is not reflective of many countries on the continent. Even for the places where we're doing clinical trials, it is heavily skewed to infectious diseases, HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and in recent times, you have what we call the emerging infections like Lassa fever, Ebola, and all that. We appreciate that there is significant infrastructural gaps and capacity gaps, which is limiting the attraction of clinical trials to the continent. It is not all gloomy though, and I took this data from recent work that IQVIA is doing. And you can see on the left of the screen, the distribution of clinical trials per population across the globe. And so in Asia, where I live, a population of 59% of the world's 59% of the world's population in Asia, but contributing to 35% of clinical trials. Now you can see a place like the Oceania region, Australia, New Zealand, where it's just about a percentage of the global population, but contributing to 6% of global clinical trials. And Europe and the Americas taking most of clinical trials. Africa, 18% of the world's population, but contributing to just 2%. But if you come to the right side of the screen, you can see some hope. And if you look at the clinical trial statistics from 2000 to 2024, you can see that it is increasing. There's a cumulated average growth rate of about 9% year on year. However, if you dig deeper into this, you see that most of the trials are what we call the late phase trials. Phase 3, phase 4 trials, and sometimes late phase 2 trials, but not the very early trials, which are a lot more complicated and sometimes to lower risk. They are held in or done in countries with a lot more experience. Then in that same picture, the good thing is that Africa therefore offers an opportunity. When you're going to run clinical trials anywhere and everywhere, you're looking at your ability to recruit patients. And this is dependent on how much of the disease you have in that community or in that population. And Africa bearing 25% of the global disease burden means we have the patients. We have a very ethnically diverse population and untapped genetically. We contribute to less than 2% of studied genome. So that is also an attraction. We have NCDs rising at a very fast rate, which is where clinical trials and most innovative medicines are heading. Another thing is that the cost of running clinical trials is way cheaper in Africa because, compensations and all that are much lower in Africa. And the good thing, one of the major hurdles for running clinical trials, which was a fragmented regulatory system, is improving quite steadily. We have many countries getting to maturity level 3 health authorities. We have the African Medical Agency, AMA as we call it, growing steadily and then having some levels of harmonization, which makes it easier to put applications through for clinical trial approval. Now, the question then would ask is, what makes any sponsor, any company, like our own, find it interesting and attractive to work or to run clinical trials, and which is what, for this purpose, we describe as the resilient health system that attracts clinical trials. And the first, I will say, is a robust health infrastructure. And I would want to share practical examples. If, for instance, you're running a clinical trial and you would need, let's say, a sub-zero temperature or very high-level freezing capabilities to store tissue, to store trial medicines and all. If you would all remember, during the COVID outbreak, the first Pfizer vaccine that came out was supposed to be a -80 cold chain vaccine, which cut out most part of low and middle income countries because that infrastructure was not readily available. Later on, we realized that it could be stored within the normal 2 to 8 normal cold chain infrastructure, and then the vaccines started coming into the our parts of the world. And so if you're running a trial with medicines like this and the infrastructure is not available, you are cut out. Again, for the purpose of this, let's say you are running a breast cancer trial and you would want to see the level of tumor regression. You are running a lung cancer trial, you want to see the improvement upon intervention, and you don't have your MRIs up and running. You don't have your pathologist able to give you the parameters that you're looking for, and you don't have the diagnostics available. You don't have the labs to run your advanced diagnostics. Then, of course, you're not going to have sponsors happy to bring clinical trials into such countries. And then we come to what we call the skilled workforce. Clinical trials is not like regular clinical practice. And the ability to run clinical trials as an investigator is the ability to follow the rigor of a protocol. And it comes as a skill that is also developed over time. And for that high level skill, we don't have. Now, even for the normal health workers, you'll be surprised to know, as I said earlier, that the only 3% of the global health workforce is servicing the whole continent of Africa. And we are now saddled with extraordinary brain drain of all the talents migrating outside of the continent. And so the skilled workforce who are skilled, trained, or can be trained is also a big challenge for the continent. And then the third is the regulatory framework. Now, the essence of a strong regulatory framework is supposed to provide clear and supportive guidelines that also protect the participants from risk and exploitation. You'd have heard of many stories and many myths, if I'll put it that way, about exploitation in clinical trial, people thinking or using participants as lab rats, as they call it, ability to report and follow up on adverse events and all. If you don't have an effective regulatory system, that again also allows for a rapid approval of protocols and a clear pathway. It becomes a disincentive for clinical trials on the continent. And the last thing is data infrastructure. If there is one company or one unit that is super guards their data, it is the biotech or the biopharmaceutical industry. Data is our everything. And so when it comes to our cybersecurity, data infrastructure, data protection, there will be no compromise ever when it comes to clinical trial. Again, there are also ethical implications when there is a breach in data, because these are patients' records, and you would never want a situation where there is a data breach and there's that record all over the place. And so there should be a clear, robust data guideline and governance that protects the sponsor and the trial. And again, data sharing laws and regulations available. So these are the things that would attract sponsors and biopharma companies to find a region attractive. There are a few others which I would show subsequently, but then the question then is, if we look at a continent like Africa, how then do we build and accelerate to have a resilient health system? And the first that I'll put here is health system investment. And this is a deliberate thing that requires political will to achieve. To make sure there are MRIs running, to make sure there are advanced diagnostics, to make sure there are advanced labs and all those things, comes with investment from the highest level, because many clinical trials around the world run in public hospitals and private hospitals also, but largely in public institutions where you have most of the patient traffic. And that is where we would want to see the investment, because the sponsor cannot tool a hospital from nothing, right? And so a high level of a standard of care is important. Investment in the regulatory system and harmonization, providing the data security, and the last but not the least, one of the most important is sustainable healthcare financing on access to the medicines that are produced. Now, this is the catch here. When a sponsor or a clinical trial happens, let us say somebody lives with diabetes on his old traditional metformin and Amaral, and is living his life. And then company X comes to try a new medicine, and the patient responds well on the medicine and is doing better than the standard of care. There is an ethical obligation on this sponsor to make sure that the patient continues to have access for this medicine, what we call the post-trial access. Now, if you would have run the clinical trial in a country where there's reimbursement, and the government now, upon approval, makes this medicine available to the population, then that burden and cost is taken off the sponsor. Otherwise, if somebody chooses to come and trial a new diabetes medicine in, say, Ghana, an injectable, it works brilliantly. People are moved from their traditional metformin, Amaryl, and all those things to that drug. And then the trial ends and you recruited 1,000 patients. What it means is that for the rest of the lives of these 1,000 patients, you need to make sure they get the medicine if it does not fall within the national health insurance. And I mean, you all will know how medicines are taken on for reimbursement. So healthcare financing and the way we think about this, both for physical infrastructure, regulations, and access to medicine is critical to attract clinical trials to the continent. The other thing is effective partnerships. I would say that the continent is such years back that we cannot continue to do things the way we do and expect that we will catch up with the rest of the world. Medicine's being developed, the technology behind clinical trials now is far advanced. And for us to get there, we need to do things differently. So that is where partnerships come in. And one is public-private partnerships. Most of clinical trials, big clinical trials, are run by the private sector, which we call the sponsors. Now, there are some key areas you can learn from, or some examples that we have seen. Practical examples happening now. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, recently put in $3.5 million with a partnership with PATH. Again, academic and industry collaborations. If you go to many parts of the world, a lot of clinical trials are run in teaching hospitals, academic centers in partnership with industry. And there are a lot of examples here that we can also talk about. I've heard those who had spoken ahead of me talk about regional collaborations and regional coalitions. The Africa Medicines Agency, the Clinical Trial Community of Africa Network, we call them CTCAN, the Africa Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator Program, that is also partnering with the EU to also accelerate vaccine manufacturing and trials in vaccine on the continent. These are key partnerships that we should support to grow, because then they help accelerate investment, regulations, and standards of clinical trials on the continent. The other thing important in a resilient system is trust. And anytime I speak about this, I take ourselves not too far back. I remember in 2015, when there is an outbreak of Ebola in some countries close to us, there were attempts to do some Ebola clinical trial in Ghana. And with all, I would say, intent of good towards the population, we all know what happened. There was a big fury around it, and one of the leading scientists in Ghana was charged with contempt of parliament and had to go to parliament with an astute lawyer to go and apologize because he had called them ignorant. And I wouldn't say rightly so. In his right, he thought that is what they were. But they, from what they also thought about clinical trials, thought they were doing what they were doing to protect the people. And so building trust with local communities, and it's not just where the trial will be held, but politicians, clinicians. Even if we're supposed to conduct a survey among clinicians and doctors, you'll be surprised some of the answers you are going to get about clinical trials and what they mean to patients. And so that is key for the environment to be conducive and attractive to anyone who would want to do clinical trials. Another thing, the last thing I would want to put up is that an environment that is ready to learn and scale. When COVID happened, the Africa CDC Consortium for COVID vaccine trials did amazingly well, rapidly raising clinical trial sites across the continent. There was a very rapid regulatory pathway that was built, and quickly we could get a lot of clinical trials happening. If we're able to do that during COVID, I'm sure as a continent, if we put our acts together, we should be able to do same for a trial of other NCD medicines. And so we should go back to those learnings from the consortium of COVID trials, from what CT-CAN is doing, from what AMA is doing, from what some academic institutions are doing in terms of partnerships, and scale it across countries and the continent. And that is the only way we'll be able to have a resilient system that attracts the sponsor to want to do clinical trials on the continent. I want to conclude by saying that, yes, we're behind as a continent. Yes, the representation is not adequate. Yes, the medicines that are being developed now, unfortunately, are not really tailored for the African population because of our low contribution. But with strategic investment and collaboration, we should do well and follow suit where the world is leading. Thank you for the time. And Vanessa, I would suppose you have some questions for me.
Yes, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much. So as a clinical strategist, a health strategist, how do we navigate through making sure that at least we get the right data, it's in the right place, and in that effect, helping us to better the African clinical studies and research?
Thank you. Data, they say, is king, right? Now, data changes everything. It is informing policy, it is informing practice. And even now, we've gotten to the world where real-world data is replacing a lot of clinical trials or new indications. Now, how do we get the right data? At the very low level, you are talking about things like electronic medical records. There is a wealth of data in electronic medical records. So even if we can digitalize all the folders that sits in our records department and do it right, that in itself is a huge asset. The other thing is the infrastructure on which this data will be built and kept, right? The right data centers, the right networks, cloud infrastructure, that we should put in place to protect the data that we are putting there. And then for clinicians and also the proper history and taking and putting together the right thing. I don't want to take you to the advanced, data systems and the things we do in advanced clinical trials, but the very basic, simple things that you can do. If anybody can walk into Ghana, right, and at the click of a button, get the patient demographics for diabetics, very well curated. It is a wealth of information that we can do a lot of things from. But the point is, does the diabetic patient population in Kolebu speak to that in Konfanoche or even Rich? Kolebu and Konfanoche might be going too far. But can you, for instance, now sit anywhere and say, this is how the picture looks at Rich, and this is how the picture looks at in Kolebu and Ho. And for that reason, there is a trend in Ho that needs to be researched or we need to investigate it. Right. So documenting even what we have now in paper, curating them, storing and protecting them with good governance is the lowest hanging fruit I can think about.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, because indeed we are sitting on a wealth of data, and just being able to synergize and then get them into the right structure would help significantly to be able to get us what we need to ensure that the African trials, especially in oncology and basically anything that we wish to do, would be able to be made manifest. Now, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. We very much appreciate the knowledge. We appreciate the education, and definitely we have learned quite a lot. Now, in as much as we were all looking forward to the breakout sessions, unfortunately, we would not be able to have the breakout sessions to have further discussions because of the time constraint. I'm sure we would look at having more duration or a longer duration for these presentations so that we can have proper interactions. And this is the third session, and with each year it's gotten better and better. I want to say thank you to all the presenters that hopped on board today to give us their wealth of knowledge. They shared with us significant information. From Edwina, we learned about collaboration and how we can harness clinical trials here in Africa. And from Dr. Soji, we learned about clinical ethics, we learned about regulations and the importance of ensuring patient or client dignity, as well as keeping the researchers in check so that they do not stray or do go through whatever means just to get data. And from our pathologist, from Professor Kafui Akakpo, we learned about the importance of pathology in clinical trials. Indeed, once we're able to get proper details, proper information based on what we are seeing in real time, clinical trials in Africa would become something that the world would look up to. And from Dr. Anderson, we learned about the strategies and how data protection is imperative to ensure that individuals, as well as the scientists and the researchers, are protected. So again, thank you to the team, and thank you to each and every one of you that took time to tune in or to just get on board and then listen and be educated and improve on our knowledge. I have learned quite a lot, and definitely I'm leaving with a lot of information. So I would hand over to Francis, and I'm sure he has a few words for us before we end the session. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Vanessa. We're always grateful to your coordination. Thank you. So we would have to adjourn the webinar series due to time constraints. And don't forget, Professor Ajay has sent his apologies. He's going to have an in-depth review of his session, and we are going to invite other speakers for a more elaborate meeting the next time. So on behalf of Nissim Oncogenics, I thank all of you. We will send a list of attendees to our partners from the GMA Central, and your CPD points will be awarded accordingly. If you would like to get in touch with us, please visit our page, nissimoncogenetics.com. Leave a message or an inquiry, or if you'd like to partner with us, we're very happy to hear from you. So until the next time, we wish all of you, have your email addresses, so we're going to send adverts and other opportunities we have with you. So see you all next time, and bye.